Chapter 287. The Footprint of the God of the Land. 1. The altar's flame burned for a long time, extinguishing only at sunrise. The warriors left the capital, leaving behind a lingering scent of herbs and ashes. While the warriors of the Zoran tribe were the majority, their allies were also numerous. Thousands of natives began their march forward. Despite their large numbers, the warriors' equipment was lacking in quality. Iron armor was absent and many relied on leather armor. While some warriors didn't have any armor at all, instead using tattoos or combat makeup to invoke the protection of spirits. Zoran tribe's leader, Ivatar, also lacked protective armor as he rode atop a trained monster while leading the army. His upper body was adorned with numerous tattoos, which multiplied as they approached the footprint of the god of the land, a result of the sorcerers blessing him with the protection of spirits. Amazing, Tempest remarked. The warriors of Samar were deeply loved by the primal spirits, and their strong affinity with these spirits was a defining characteristic of their talent as warriors. The primal spirits lacked clear egos and were more akin to a natural form of energy, such as mana, with their own unique characteristics. Receiving their favor and blessing and borrowing their power was a separate power from the spirit magic utilized by those on the continent. That barbarian is receiving a simple yet powerful blessing. He is loved by many primal spirits. The power of the primal spirit that is blessing Ivatar Jahav is no less than the other spirit kings or me. Countless primal spirits empowered Ivatar, lending him power as he dashed over the ground. The spirits of the land would aid him while the wind would allow him to fly. At his request, flames would appear, lightning would strike, or rain would fall, all at the whim of the powerful spirits. The Magic Tower Masters and Christina were busy even during the march. Christina was occupied receiving Anisa's teachings regarding divine magic suited for wars. This would be Christina's first war, and frankly she would be placed in an extremely harsh condition. Not only was she solely responsible for the production and distribution of holy water, but she would also be the sole caster of divine magic in this war. She would have to tackle everything alone without the assistance of any other priests. The same was true for the Tower Masters of the Magic Towers. The Kochilla tribe used demonic beasts. It was difficult to estimate their numbers, but in order to counter the demonic beasts they used, Lovelian would have to put in a lot of effort as a summoner. The group found a silver lining when they discovered that the sorcerers of the Zoran tribe were more skilled than initially expected. Although sorcery was quite different from traditional magic, both trades relied on the use of mana. Once taught a few tricks, the sorcerers were able to provide valuable magical assistance. Naturally, the Tower Masters had to provide the formula for the magic. Lovelian worked on defensive magical formulas, even reducing the number of hours he slept. It was in preparation for Edmund's bombing magic from the skies above. On the other hand, Balzac devoted himself to preparing defensive black magic. In addition, he revealed his signature blind to everyone as well. Melkith seemed relaxed and she kept grinning like an idiot. Whenever someone asked her why she was so happy, she would reply that it was a secret with a stern expression, but everyone could guess what had happened from her blatant attitude. "I can't understand." Tempest would mutter so from time to time, but Eugene ignored the voice. With Ivatar taking the lead, the group managed to reach the footprint of the god of the land in only a week. They had wanted to occupy the battlefield in advance and had truly believed that they would beat their enemies to it. They had taken the shortest routes with the blessing of the forest, and the spirits had been pushing their back to speed them up. It had been natural to think that they would arrive before their enemies. It had been a miscalculation. The enemies would have never set the scene of their battle in a place that they could not occupy first. Even though the Allied forces had yet to arrive at the location, everyone could tell through their skin that the Kochillas had already set up camp. The forest had taken on a strange and eerie quality. Silence hung in the air like a thick blanket, without even the sound of insects or birds breaking it. The trees and foliage were lifeless, and the usually vibrant colors had faded away. The only plants and trees with color were artificial, and the fragrance of the forest had been replaced by the stench of death. It was as if the life force of the forest had been drained away, leaving behind a barren wasteland. Anxiety settled on the expressions of the warriors as they marched. They broke cold sweat not because of the hot and humid weather but because of fear. Boom! A loud noise erupted from the front. It wasn't an ambush or anything, but rather Ivatar suddenly thumping his fist against his chest. Woo, woo, woo. Ivatar roared while thumping his chest and stomping his feet. The short, curt cry pushed away the fear of death from his troops and regenerated their morale. "He's like a gorilla," Melkith commented from not too far away with a grin. Eugene felt rather puzzled. Melkith wasn't showing any trace of fear. "Isn't it your first time participating in a war of this size, Lady Melkith? Are you fine?" asked Eugene. "You're saying something so innocent, little bro." Melkith chuckled and responded after lowering her voice. "It's natural for geniuses to be hated by others. Geniuses are usually lonely and normies form groups. What about me? I'm not just a regular genius but one of the greatest geniuses in history. How often do you think they tried to keep me, Melkith Al-Haya, in check before I got to where I am? I can easily count dozens of assassins who came to kill me before I was even an adult." Lovelian did not comment, but he nodded after hearing her words. Although they had never experienced a war like this, every day had been no different from a war until they stabilized their position and power with the overwhelming talent they possessed. "I see. You're bound to be experienced with how old you are," said Eugene. "And what about you? Are you okay, little bro? Aren't you just pretending to be strong? If you're scared and tired, you can hide behind my back as much as you want," said Melkith. "Well, I'm used to it, so it's fine," Eugene said. The forest came to an end. Ivatar looked down with glaring eyes. This was the only place in Samar that was not forested, a valley reaching down dozens of meters. A few months ago, Ivatar fought against the warriors of the Coachella tribe in this place, the footprint of the god of the land. However, the scenery he saw back then could not be found. The footprint of the god of the land was pitch black, as if someone had painted it with the night sky, and the vast land was filled with the warriors of the Coachella tribe. It wasn't only humans who lined the valley either. There were heinous creatures different from regular monsters. Helmuth had given control of demonic beasts for the Coachella tribe to use in the war, and they stood at the front line. Boom, boom, boom. The sound of the beating drum began to reverberate from the depths of the valley. The drum, which was made from human skin, vomited a dull, gloomy sound. There were other instruments as well. A whistle created from drilling holes in a human skull created a terrible harmony with the drum. Looking at the scene unfolding before him, Ivatar grimaced, leaving his smile distorted. He then took the horn from the warrior next to him and took a deep breath before blowing into it. With a mighty blast, the horn shattered into pieces, unable to withstand the force of Ivatar's breath. However, its sound had drowned out the drums and whistles of the Coachella tribe, silencing them momentarily. As the warriors at the rear of the Coachillas raised their tribe's black and red flags, Ivatar grabbed Zoran tribe's flag from his shoulder. But instead of waving or raising the flag, he reared back and hurled it down the valley like a spear. As soon as he hurled the flag, Ivatar galloped down the cliff with a roar. The flag of the Zorans was planted in the land, and as if on cue, Ivatar kicked off the ground. The blessing of the young forest that enveloped Ivatar caused the earth to shift. The spirits that accompanied him seeped into the dead land, causing the steep slope to soften for the warriors to descend. The warriors of the Zoran tribe and the allied tribes echoed Ivatar's roar when they saw his charge. Then, following this brave warrior, they charged down the slope into the footprint of the god of the land. Edmund was there at the rear of the Coachella tribe's army. He adorned a graceful purple robe instead of a black one, a favorite of many black wizards, and held Vladimir in one hand. Around him stood the sorcerers of the Coachillas, who had been educated in black magic from an early age. Hector and the Death Knight stood in front of them. The Death Knight would move according to his own will, and they would not need Hector to stand guard either. The two entities would move around the battlefield and kill of their own accord. "So you didn't run away," muttered Edmund while caressing his trimmed beard. Even though he stood far away, Edmund had installed magical eyes on all sides of the battlefield, identifying his enemies in detail. Although he had shown them mercy, warning them to run away, none of them had chosen to do so. They have quite a formidable force, but it is not the victory or defeat of the battle that matters to me. Edmund smirked while channeling dark power into Vladimir. He had twisted the earth veins in the region in advance and connected it to himself and Vladimir. The land was already prepared for the ritual. Regardless of whether the warriors of the Coachella tribe or the enemies died, The blood and soul spilled in the land would be sacrificed for the ritual. It would allow Edmund to complete his ritual before the outcome of the battle could be decided. I'm sure they know this as well. That must be why they chose not to run. Instead of running, they had foolishly chosen to attempt to hinder his ritual. Edmund chuckled as he raised Vladimir high. Maybe Eugene had made this choice because he was the hero. In a battle between wizards and between archwizards in particular, taking the initiative with one's signature was the most important in determining the outcome of the battle, as well as the inherent advantage of certain magic over others. In that respect, Edmund's signature, cube, was almost absent from any weaknesses, exuding the arrogance of the archwizard who had created this magic. There were black lines all around Edmund, connecting to form the shape of a cube. What Edmund's signature pursued was simple: absolute defense and immortality. It was nigh impossible to magically pierce through the cube once activated. It would be impossible for anyone to leave even a scratch on the cube without far exceeding Edmund's reservoir of power, which included his use of Vladimir and the Demon King's dark power. In addition, Edmund possessed immortality far exceeding that of high-ranking demons while he was inside the cube. Even if an attack penetrated the cube and damaged Edmund's body, the dark power filling the cube would instantly heal his wounds. Edmund's signature was arrogant. It was near perfect, offering him an invincible shield against any and all attacks. But while it provided him with immortality, it offered him nothing in terms of offense. This was by design, for Edmund considered himself the embodiment of the ultimate attack. But even though he was arrogant in his creation, he wasn't mistaken. Edmund did, in fact, possess an absolute level of attack. Vladimir was brimming with dark power, and the sorcerers of the Coachella tribe chanted and synchronized with the dark power in a formation around Edmund. "I'd be happy to just sit around like this," Edmund commented. No one could break through cube anyway. Edmund could simply rest and watch everything unfold from inside the cube until enough offerings were gathered. But why would he? He already possessed an overwhelming advantage, so why would he remain inactive and watch? A fierce smile appeared on his lips. A large gathering of dark power stretched long and sharp in the sky, transforming into spears of death that would extinguish everything in their paths. Christina Rogerus was capable of engaging in direct battle. She was a competent wielder of the flail reworked from Anissa's mace, and even if she wasn't against demonic creatures, she could intercept them with divine magic. However, Christina remained behind on the cliff instead of heading down into the footprint of the god of the land. She was the sole priest on the battlefield, and she needed to be more rational and objective than anyone else on the chaotic battlefield before she intervened. The battle was already underway, with the two opposing sides locked in a fierce struggle. Ivatar was a fearsome sight to behold, wielding two massive axes with incredible strength and precision. He charged into the fray without hesitation, tearing through the Coachella tribe's front lines with ease. The warriors and the demonic beasts became entangled, and the Coachella tribe's warriors followed behind the demonic beasts. Far up in the sky, spears of death took form. The death spears aimed for the rear of the allied army, attempting to destroy them with a single blow. Christina. "Yes, sister." Christina took a breath, then grabbed the rosary hanging around her neck. She started to shine brilliantly with divine power, and Anise further fueled the fire, providing Christina with her own divine power unsparingly. Even though 300 years had passed, the word saint still reminded everyone of Anise the faithful. However, once this little war in the forest came to an end, the natives of the forest, the surviving warriors, would think of someone else when they heard the word saint. Anise herself was determined to make it so. Whoosh! 8 wings unfolded behind Christina. Anise's consciousness merged with Christina's. When Christina raised her hand, the light swirling around her concentrated on her fingertips. A brilliant cross appeared in the sky, acting as a huge shield that blocked the rushing spear of death. Boom! Light and darkness became entangled before dispersing into nothingness. There were no other priests to assist Christina in this place, but Anise the faithful was providing her with power. Edmund's spear of death was purified without penetrating the cross of light. The saint. Christina wasn't the only one who remained behind on the cliff. Lovelian stood not far from her, and he could not help but show awe for Christina's brilliant miracle. He had heard in advance regarding the signature of the staff of incarceration, Edmund Cordeth. Absolute defense and immortality were powers that any wizard vulnerable to close combat would die for. The Green Tower Master's signature, Yggdrasil, pursues the same goals, but their completeness is incomparable. Although Yggdrasil was an ability that focused on defense and immortality, it was somewhat ambiguous in nature. The user had the power to transform their body into a massive tree, providing protection from harm. However, the ability set too many goals beyond the user's capacity, and the tree itself was too massive. Its defenses were easily penetrable, and although the tree could regenerate, it did not grant the wizard immortality. But what about the cube? It formed the perfect size cube around Edmund, just large enough to encompass Edmund. It was simple and neat, pursuing only absolute defense and immortality with its small size. It did well to demonstrate Edmund's abilities as a great wizard. Well, Lovelian couldn't help but express his amazement as a wizard, impressed by Edmund's remarkable ability. As an arch-wizard himself, he knew that creating a signature of that level was beyond his capabilities. Yet he didn't feel any hint of jealousy towards him. Magic was an endless study, something that couldn't be confined to any specific framework. The cube, while impressive, wasn't the kind of magic that he personally pursued. Without saying a word, Lovelian joined his hands together. If all he needed were sacrifices, he would not have had to cause such a big war. He could have simply slaughtered the Coachella tribe's warriors or ordered them to kill themselves. He came to war because he doesn't need only blood and souls. Right, he's in need of ecstasy. Archwizards would only experience it a few times in their lives, usually when they made a breakthrough from the 7th to the 8th circle. When they managed to overcome an apparently impenetrable wall and ascend to the next level, their consciousness would be lost in the union of mana, circles, and magic. This wasn't a phenomenon that affected only wizards either. Knights and warriors would also experience ecstasy when they gained profound enlightenment that allowed them to reach the next level. The same was likely true of this war. The state that Edmund would reach in a bloody war, granted to him by the excitement and madness born at the moment when life, blood, and soul became insignificant, was what he pursued. Only in that moment would the souls gain their superior value as sacrifices. Once such saturated souls died on the battlefield, Edmund would assert his dominance over blood and soul. That was the law Edmund imposed on the ritual, and it was impossible for nearly anyone to interfere with a ritual of such scale and completeness. But if that were the case, you simply needed to bring another law into coexistence. If death was a preemptive condition to be met, then one simply needed to take befitting countermeasures. Pantheon. Lovelian's signature did not require any complicated techniques or chanting. It simply allowed him to call his summons created beforehand. Boom. A huge door was summoned from a different dimension and stood tall on the ground. The red door, which was etched with complex patterns, began to vibrate. Lovelian disentangled his hands and grabbed his staff. Pantheon's doors opened. Lovelian's consciousness was already synchronized with Pantheon, and countless summons subdued or created by Lovelian cried from inside the door. The creatures mixed and synthesized at a command from Lovelian. He did not bother combining all the creatures into one, but instead formed them into the best combinations for this particular battlefield. He focused on predation. He did not plan on allowing any corpse to touch the ground or their blood to soak into the soil. He would not allow their souls to spill. The combination of his creatures would devour corpses and trap souls in their stomachs. It would be impossible to completely prevent Edmund's ritual from progressing, but he could still delay it by slowing the collection of offerings. The cleaners poured out of Pantheon. Yahweh! Melkith uttered a near-screaming cry. She was already elated, as if she were in a state of ecstasy. It was only natural. She was more absorbed in her greatness than she cared about the war, the corpses, and the sacrifices. In truth, she had been lucky. She had tried all sorts of things with the Fire Spirit Stone to no avail, ultimately failing to sign a contract with Ifrit at first. The Samar Forest was renowned as the paradise of spirits, a place teeming with mana and spirits. But now, darkness had descended upon the forest as black magic seeped into its core, twisting the earth veins and polluting the natural balance. A dark ritual was underway, one that sought to create a demon king and unleash untold horrors upon the world. Levin, the spirit king of lightning, and Janos, the spirit king of earth, were infuriated with the situation. The same was true for Ifrit, the spirit king of fire. As a result, Melkith succeeded in contracting with Ifrit on the condition of saving the forest and stopping Edmund's atrocities. Chapter 288. The Footprint of the God of the Land 2. The footprint of the God of the land became obscured by a curtain of darkness. The all-encompassing curtain seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, blotting out the sky and plunging the land into a bleak and desolate state devoid of any illumination. Blind, Balzac Ludbeth's signature, initially robbed those affected of their sight as its name suggested. No matter where they looked, those affected by blind were plunged into an endless darkness, unable to see themselves or anyone else around them. It was a signature with absolute power in this kind of war, but it was true that the spell was absurdly simple. However, blind did not simply rob the targets of their vision. Instead, sight was only the first sense that blind took away. The longer one remained inside blind, their other senses would start to become obscured as well. The hearing came after sight and the targets would become deaf. Next was the sense of smell and then touch. Even if you cut yourself with a knife, you would fail to feel the pain. But it didn't end there. After losing one's sight, hearing, smell, and touch, one would lose their sense of spirit, which could be called the sixth sense. Regardless of whether they were wizards, knights, or warriors, they would no longer be able to sense mana. Even then, after having extorted all five senses except taste as well as one's sense of spirit, blind's effects would not lessen. Slowly, very slowly, blind would rob its targets of their consciousness. In complete darkness where you could feel nothing except taste, they would even end up losing a sense of self. It was purposely set up in this way as a gradual extortion of senses because it was impossible to rob someone of all their senses all at once, even if blind was a signature of an archwizard. The Veil of Darkness was a darkness created by Balzac's magic, and it was similar to a type of poison. Simply being inside the curtain would intoxicate someone, and the effects of the poison would only get stronger over time. As I expected, Edmund's cube is inviolable. Balzac stood on the blackened ground. Cochilla's forces had fallen into a state of panic, and they were starting to run rampant. On the other hand, the warriors of the Zoran tribe and the allied tribes were unaffected by blind's restrictions. They marched and attacked as if there was no darkness at all, pushing back the Cochillas. This range and number. Balzac joined hands and began to make calculations. Although there would be differences between individuals, generally, it would take about 10 minutes for blind to take away the enemy's sense of hearing. In another 10 minutes, their sense of smell would disappear and it would take a bit longer to rob them of touch, 15 minutes at most. 20 minutes after that, their sense of spirit would disappear. The last thing would be robbing them of their sense of self. But, in truth, Balzac was uncertain about the exact timing of the final stage of blind. It was a gradual process and varied depending on the strength of one's willpower. However, there was no need to take it that far in the first place. In the next hour, the enemies would lose all their senses and be rendered useless in the battle. If the conditions were met, Balzac's blind could neutralize and exterminate even tens of thousands of troops. But I do not need to shoulder the burden right now. With a bitter smile, Balzac reached down and placed his palms against the ground once more. It wasn't particularly difficult to escape the effects of blind. One could simply walk out of it. However, the terrain of the valley, the pushing allies, and the presence of Edmund standing behind the warriors of the Cochilla tribe made it impossible for them to flee from the curtain. But I guess it's the same for me. Balzac turned his head with a grin. He saw Lovelian commanding the summons of Pantheon from the cliff. The great summoner kept an eye on the battlefield while issuing a command in perfect order to well over 100 creatures and at the same time monitoring Balzac's every move. Balzac was conscious of the magical dagger in his heart. Although he considered himself quite skilled in trickery, Balzac knew it was impossible to escape the existence of the dagger. He could not deceive it. I could have if it were a magical oath instead. Balzac had signed a contract of the soul with the Demon King of Incarceration, which meant that his oath to the Demon King took precedence over any other oaths, including magical oaths. As such, Lovelian had chosen to make use of a dagger to threaten the destruction of Balzac's heart. Moreover, he continued to surveil Balzac, which showed his distrust of the Black Wizard. I don't want to be misunderstood. Balzac touched the ground with a bitter smile. He had no intention of betraying Eugene or Lovelian in this war. His purpose had been clear and straightforward from the start, and it was himself, not anyone else, that he was trying to deceive in this darkness. Blind. Edmund gritted his teeth. He had a rough idea about Balzac's signature. It was a curtain of darkness that exterminated the target's senses one by one, starting with sight. However, he had never seen or experienced it in person since the two of them had never been at odds with each other. Magical poison. Impossible for me to detoxify. I won't be able to interfere with it either, Edmund muttered. As a wizard, Edmund had absolute confidence in his abilities. However, it was still impossible to destroy a signature of an archwizard on the spot. But Edmund had made preparations. He had been reluctant to use it if possible, but it seemed he had no other choice. Edmund raised Vladimir while chanting. Blind's darkness could not invade Edmund's cube. Even amidst the deep darkness, Edmund's vision was preserved. Moreover, fortunately, the magical eye he planted earlier in the footprint of the god of the land was still in good shape as well. Edmund's original plan had been to reflect the field of vision on everyone's retina. However, this was no longer feasible since the warriors were already completely robbed of their sight. The other senses will be taken away sequentially after sight. It will take dozens of minutes at the earliest until shutdown since it's a type of poison. How long will it take to take away their sense of spirit? It was impossible to infer precisely. All he could do was to respond the best he could at the moment. Vladimir's dark power started seeping into the space around him. Ugh. The sorcerers near Edmund groaned. Wanting to preserve his strength as much as possible, Edmund took the life force of the sorcerers as fuel for black magic. Dark power became finely dispersed throughout the battlefield and pervaded the warriors of the Coachella tribe. Their confusion quickly subsided and the warriors rapidly reorganized. Although they were still unable to see, they could now distinguish dark power through their sense of spirit. Maybe Balzac saw through it. But our dark power is not exactly the same. Just as Edmund did, it was also possible for Balzac to disperse his dark power throughout the battlefield to induce confusion. Of course, Edmund was aware of this fact and had made adequate preparations for it as well. It's your failure, Balzac Ludbeth. You could not cover my eyes after all. His cube remained untouched. It was clear to Edmund what his next course of action should be. First he would find Balzac and kill him. With a wicked grin, Edmund raised Vladimir in an attempt to locate Balzac's presence on the battlefield. However, after a brief moment, his eyes quivered with confusion. Although he was exploring the battlefield extensively with his dark power, he could not identify Balzac anywhere. Edmund was unconvinced. His cube was intact and untouched, as was everything else of his. So why couldn't he find Balzac? You damned. Fwoosh. From beyond the curtain of darkness, a piercing beam of light shone through. Though the blind warriors could not see it, the warriors of the Zoran tribe and the allied tribes watched in awe as the light cascaded down like a healing rain. The light's touch revived the fallen allies, pulling them back from the brink of death. Although the light did not completely heal all wounds, it brought back those on the brink of death, allowing them to stagger to their feet and seize their weapons once more. Kaiawea. Melkith charged while screaming. Lightning flashed and flames burst with each of her footsteps. Edmund gritted his teeth when he saw her. He truly could not believe his eyes. How had a single wizard signed a contract with 3 spirit kings? Firstly, the saint. No, it might be better to leave her alone for now. Edmund quickly regained his composure. Although the battlefield was obscured by blind, it wasn't disadvantageous for him. His purpose wasn't to win the war but to complete the ritual. As their vision faded, the warriors' other senses sharpened. Edmund knew this well and seized the opportunity. He breathed the dark power into them, a force that heightened their spirit and transformed their fear into frenzied madness. It was no different for his enemies either. They held an advantage on the battlefield and were filled with the excitement of prospective victory. The light, which continued to bring them back to life, wasn't necessarily only helpful to Edmund's enemies. The flame of life that bloomed as the warriors collided would fatten the consciousness and souls of the warriors, which would become sacrifices for the ritual. I'll have to kill the White Tower Master first. A master of spirit magic who was contracted with 3 spirit kings. There had never been such a wizard in the history of the continent, and there would not be one in the future as well. It was no exaggeration to say that she was a walking disaster, and her presence alone could change the outcome of the war. That's why he needed to exterminate her now. Ominous dark power flowed from Vladimir. Rumbly. The ground around Melkith started to shake. Contractor, Janos, the spirit king of earth, gave a warning. "I know," Melkith muttered. Rumbly. Thick chains sprang up from the blackened ground. "I guess you want to kill this lady." The chains were about to wrap around her limbs, but Melkith scoffed and stamped her foot. The ground responded, fists rising and grabbing onto the chains. And then, with flames wrapped around her fist, Melkith struck with a fiery punch. Fire punch. The spear of death collided with the fist of flame. However, Edmund had more attacks in store. Large demonic beasts hiding deep in the ground ambushed Melkith at his command. Thunderbolt kick. Her posture was completely disastrous, but lightning accompanied her kick and decimated the demonic beasts. Edmund's shoulders heaved at the sight. How could someone with so much power be so undignified? He felt genuine contempt. This is troublesome. Hector let out a frustrated click of his tongue and blinked, his 4 eyes scanning the darkness around him in vain. Despite his best efforts, he couldn't discern anything in the inky blackness. Still, he had an understanding of the current situation. His soul was directly connected to Edmund, so he could hear the wizard's messages. His body was filled with Edmund's dark power, and it was reinforced in many ways. At first, blindness was hard to get used to, but after some time he was able to get a sense of his surroundings. He still had his sense of hearing and smell, as well as the sense of touch and the keen sense of spirit. Once he was actively immersed in the remaining senses, he was able to see his surroundings quite well. It felt as if he were observing the space from someone else's eyes. Hector moved with confidence as he engaged in battle with his new body. Yet he remained level-headed, never allowing himself to get carried away. He understood his own abilities and limitations all too well. Despite the tremendous strength of his new form, he had learned a valuable lesson from his humiliating defeat at the hands of the Death Knight, one that had stripped him of any sense of arrogance. He had abandoned his pride in his skills at the Black Lion Castle. Hector knew that Eugene Lionheart was a man of monstrous talent, someone he could not best even after 1,000 battles. Nothing would have changed. Hector knew the difference between himself and Eugene, and yet he searched for Eugene. He knew well the reason for his search. It was longing, or rather jealousy disguised as longing. He knew he had no chance against Eugene, but he wanted to see Eugene fight, and if possible he wanted to see Eugene die. Eugene wasn't the only one Hector searched for. He was also looking for Cyan Lionheart, the next head of the family. Hector knew that Cyan was on the battlefield somewhere. Eugene wasn't his only target of jealousy. Hector had known from an early age that he was talented. However, he had been forced to concede just because he was born into the collateral line of the family. But what about the twins of the main family? Were they truly more talented than Hector? He didn't think so. In fact, the twins had failed to stop him in the forest at the Black Lion Castle. But I couldn't kill them with my hands at the time. The twins had been needed as a living sacrifice for Uad's ritual. However, that was no longer the case. There was no reason to keep Cyan Lionheart alive any longer. Despite the special treatment they received for being born into the main line of the family, Cyan Lionheart was no different from any other corpses on this battlefield. He gazed at the abomination approaching him, its monstrous form slithering toward him. Unlike anything he had ever seen, it was a grotesque amalgamation of mismatched limbs and body parts that defied all human understanding. With 6 heterogeneous arms, a body made up of a grotesque patchwork of creatures, and a hideous face, it was as far from human as anything could be. But despite the creature's horrible appearance, and even though they weren't the creature's original eyes, Cyan could feel Hector from the creature's 4 eyes. It is said that the eyes reflect the soul. Hector laughed, his 4 blind eyes contorting as he spoke. Cyan spat at his words. "You should have disappeared quietly after dying. I didn't expect you to return as a monster." "Are you going to fight me?" asked Hector. "Then should I run?" "Why should I?" "Hector, you betrayed the Lionheart clan. If nothing else, I'll make sure to kill you with my own hands," responded Cyan. Even though he was facing a hideous monster, he didn't feel scared. It was quite fascinating and amazing. Even though Hector was easily 3 times as large as him, the thought of retreating didn't even occur to Cyan. Instead, he knew he had to move forward. For Cyan, it was a mission. It would be dishonorable to run when a traitor, one who disgraced the Lionheart's name, stood in front of him. He couldn't possibly do so as the next head of the Lionheart family. Cyan gripped his sword in his right hand and held Geddon's shield in his left. He wore the uniform of the Lionheart's main family to stave off any feelings of shame, and he felt a warmth emanating from the left side of his chest. It was as though the symbol of his family was aglow with energy. Naturally, Hector could not see Cyan's uniform or the symbol of the Lionheart family. However, he could feel the vivid malice coming from Cyan. With his other senses serving as his eyes, he could see the flames of white mana winding around Cyan's body. The flames began to flutter like a lion's mane. Purple flames flared in the form of wings. It was Eugene's signature, prominence, and the magnificent wings left feathers of fire floating in the darkness. A few feathers drifted towards the outskirt of the curtain of darkness, near Christina and Lovelian. It was so that he could respond in case anyone attacked the two. "I can't see Balzac." It did not catch Eugene off guard. The quickest way to undo blind was to kill Balzac. As such, they had discussed in advance that Balzac would hide while maintaining blind to devote himself to interfering with and obstructing Edmund's ritual. Of course, Eugene did not fully trust Balzac's words. As such, he focused on the magical dagger. If he sensed any progress in the ritual and could attribute it as being Balzac's work, Eugene would shred his heart without any hesitation. And in order to accurately grasp the current situation, Eugene distributed Prominence's feathers all over the battlefield. "Cyan." Eugene frowned. He had left a few feathers near Cyan so that he could intervene if Cyan were in danger. Currently, Cyan was engaged in a battle with an unknown monster. Should I go kill him? Apparently the monster was Hector. He had never expected Hector to return in such a shape. Despite his strength, Eugene believed Hector was too formidable for Cyan to handle. However, to his surprise, Cyan was holding his own in the battle. He expertly wielded Geddon's shield to block Hector's attacks and took advantage of any openings to strike with his sword. Cyan's white flames burned fiercely, growing more intense as the fight raged on. In the end, Eugene decided not to intervene. He judged that the battle against Hector was necessary for Cyan. Moreover, there were other things Eugene needed to worry about. He needed to kill Edmund to stop the ritual. Even though Edmund's cube boasted absolute defense, Eugene was certain he could crush the cube with the light of the Holy Sword or the Moonlight Sword. In addition, "I knew you would come," Eugene muttered, reaching into his cloak. He could see the Death Knight approaching him through the darkness. "Trivial tricks," the Death Knight scoffed. He was undead and his body had died a long time ago. His heart was not beating and he had always been blind. It meant that he was unaffected by the altercations to his senses. The Death Knight lost nothing in blind and he glared at Eugene with a frown. "Little boy, I couldn't fight well last time because—" "That's a long excuse," Eugene interrupted with a snort while shaking his head. It was an undisguised mockery. The Death Knight's expression hardened. "Certainly." He drew his blade. Chapter 289. The Footprint of the God of the Land 3. Although he was incapable of using mana, the Death Knight still had an accurate grasp over its flow. He stared at Eugene with slightly open eyes. Vermouth's flames wove around Eugene like the mane of a lion. 300 years ago this flame had no name. However, after the establishment of the Lionheart family, it was given a name, the White Flame Formula. From what he knew, the White Flame Formula consisted of cores called stars that determined one's skill level. Purple flames. Has he developed his mana in a different way than Vermouth? Or did he independently develop Vermouth's mana training method? The Death Knight couldn't be sure, but he could feel that Eugene's flame was special. Each of the scattering embers was an absurdly highly concentrated petal of mana. Moreover, a flame wasn't the only thing surrounding Eugene. There were also flashes of living lightning mixed in with the fire of pure mana. And unlike the fire, the lightning felt as if it were alive. And what's that behind his back? Is it wings? What bothered him the most was the wing of fire stretching behind Eugene's back. It looked like a wing on the surface. But it bothered him that only a single wing existed. The wing definitely wasn't for flying. It meant the wing would serve another purpose, but the Death Knight could not guess its use. He could tell that the wing wasn't a simple manifestation of mana. It was a type of magic, but unfortunately the Death Knight was completely ignorant of magic. 300 years ago during his life, it had been fine for him to be ignorant. Even if the Death Knight ignored magic, he had comrades who would respond to it. Though now he didn't want to think about them. The Death Knight leaned forward while grinding his teeth. It would be different from last time. At that time he had not been thinking straight. 3 centuries had passed and no one born in this generation could defeat him, Hamel. He knew that it would not be an easy fight. Even so, he was confident in his victory. He would win. He had to win. The Death Knight couldn't fathom losing to a distant descendant of Vermouth, not even to Vermouth himself. With a push off the ground, he set his sights on reaching his enemy in an instant, ready to strike him down without hesitation. Eugene vanished, causing the Death Knight to panic briefly. It was ironic, given that he was already dead, but his sharp senses picked up on the slight mana disturbance. Without hesitation, he flung himself to the side. Eugene was using Carbos, the dragon spear, but unlike when Vermouth had used it in the Death Knight's memories, it didn't make any loud noises. "Unpleasant bastard," muttered the Death Knight. Last time, the brat had wielded dubbing, yet now he opted for a spear? The Death Knight felt annoyed at how his adversary seemed to underestimate him. The Death Knight wielded his sword with irritation and anger. Like Eugene's spear, the Death Knight's weapon made no noise as it moved. The dark power swirling around his blade was calm and subdued. The blade moved sluggishly, then suddenly flashed. "Azure Rampage," Eugene whispered under his breath. He was no stranger to the disorienting whirlwind of attacks. Eugene had already battled against Hamel in the dark room in the Lionheart Mansion's basement. But if he had to compare the two, the Hamel from back then had wielded a sharper and faster sword. Perhaps it was a matter of course. The Hamel in the dark room represented Eugene's reflection, an existence that was a few steps ahead, embodying what Eugene had strived for as Hamel. He had died horribly at his own hands, experiencing deaths numbering well over a dozen in just half a year. Eugene's memories were surfacing with heightened clarity. There was no weakness in Azure Rampage, and it's not like Hamel had any habits he could exploit either. Since there was no weakness, there was nothing to target. Nevertheless, Eugene possessed the knowledge of how to counter such a situation. Confronted with a relentless barrage of attacks, he merely needed to reciprocate in kind. Stepping back, Eugene firmly grasped the dragon spear with both hands. Azure Rampage was not limited to swordplay alone. The spear trembled and split into numerous mirrored forms. The wavering flames coalesced into spear-like shapes. The Death Knight's sword slashed, the spear thrust, the sword stabbed, and the spear crushed. The frenzy of 2 distinct weapons intertwined in a chaotic dance. Naturally, the Death Knight was pushed back. It was impossible to overwhelm Eugene with a technique based on shadows of the past. The moment the Death Knight was forced to pull out, light gathered at the tip of the dragon's spear. Boom! While the Death Knight hadn't anticipated his defeat in the exchange, he had foreseen the impending blast from the dragon's spear. His face tensed, and he narrowly evaded the strike by swiftly contorting his body. Anticipating the blast had granted him an opportunity to seamlessly transition his movement into a counterattack. The dark power coating his hands started to swell, and he unleashed infinite purgatory with sword force derived from dark power. It threatened to rip everything in its path to pieces. But Eugene was already prepared with a different weapon. It was Asphal, the devouring sword, with jagged fang-like protrusions on its edge. Asphal effortlessly cleaved through the sword force of dark power. Undeterred, Eugene advanced, taking another step forward and delivering a powerful swing of Asphal aimed at the Death Knight's chest. The layer of dark power acting as the Death Knight's defense was torn apart. Not wanting to take another step back, the Death Knight thrust his blade into Asphal's orbit, attempting to stop the attack in its path. Clang! A metallic thud reverberated through the air as Eugene swiftly withdrew Asphal without any hesitation. He switched weapons once more. It was the Annihilation Hammer. The Death Knight's eyes quivered with shock. There was no possible way he was unaware of the hammer's existence. WNOID, Carbos, Asphal, and now the Annihilation Hammer? Only Vermouth had been capable of handling the equipment of the Demon Kings. How was it possible that his descendant was capable of doing so as well? No, that wasn't important right now. It didn't matter how the kid was able to use the Annihilation Hammer. The spear, sword, and hammer were vastly distinct weapons, each requiring a unique handling approach. Yet Eugene effortlessly transitioned between them, showcasing a remarkable fluidity in his weapon changes. The unsettling sensation from their previous encounter intensified, leaving the Death Knight perplexed. He was just too similar. He was supposed to be Vermouth's descendant, so why? Why are you similar to me and not Vermouth? Crunch. The Annihilation Hammer flung the Death Knight into the sky. Although the Death Knight had defended against the attack with dark power, the power contained in the blow caused his body to throb. Whoosh. Eugene instantly closed in on the Death Knight. He was simply too fast. How many enemies had been so fast in the past? No, in the first place had he ever faced such a fast opponent? And it wasn't as if he were only fast. Boom. The following attack pushed the Death Knight even further away. It was WYD again, and a storm devoured him. The Death Knight swung his sword while tracking the storm with his eyes. He performed the seemingly impossible, cutting through the wind. The wind swirled around his blade and changed its course. Parrying, redirecting an attack like such, was Hamel's specialty. Eugene's lips twitched as he approached the Death Knight. Clearly, Eugene felt a deep sense of annoyance and dissatisfaction with the present circumstances. However, he couldn't afford to unveil his true identity, aware that Amelia Merwin might be listening. Unable to express his sentiments directly, Eugene yearned to vehemently deny the existence of the bastard and everything associated with them. The two blades clashed once more. The Death Knight attempted to deflect Eugene's sword once more, just as before, but failed. On the contrary, WE teased the Death Knight by slipping away from the Death Knight's intended flow. Again, he was being pushed back. The Death Knight's expression crumpled. Whoosh. A surge of dark power emanated from the Death Knight's body and sword, attempting to seize WED. Yet Eugene swiftly countered by twisting WED, resulting in a fusion of storm and flame. The grip of dark power faltered, overpowered by Eugene's formidable strength. The Death Knight's sword was held in its place. He hurriedly extended his left hand towards Eugene, causing dark power to shoot toward his chest. However, it was blocked by Eugene once more, a wall of flame rising to stop the Death Knight. Beyond the wall of flames, Eugene's cloak fluttered. Boom! An arrow of thunder shot from inside his cape. It was an attack from Thunderbolt Pernoa. The arrow failed to penetrate through the Death Knight since it wasn't shot directly. It instead propelled him skyward once again, leaving him airborne. Kook! The Death Knight raised his sword while chewing on his lips. A door opened from inside his unbeating heart. Deep underground in a desert far from here, the magic of the Demon King under Amelia Merwin's control transcended the distance. An endless burst of dark power surged out from the door. Hua! The Death Knight's sword became engulfed in dark power. The overwhelming power caused the sword's pommel and the blade to disintegrate. Even so, the Death Knight was still holding onto a sword. It was a weapon formed from crystals that were formed from the pure, destructive waves of dark power. The weapon emanated a pressure incomparable to before. Eugene's lips twisted into a sneer as he stored the Annihilation Hammer into the cloak. He chose Altair, the brilliant holy sword. Even though the curtain of darkness covered the footprint of the god of the land, the Death Knight's dark power dyed his surroundings a deeper shade of darkness. The sword of dark power was black, while Eugene's holy sword shone brilliantly. Eugene slowly raised the sword while activating the white flame formula. The 6 stars shone brilliantly, and a purple flame enveloped the light of the holy sword. Once again, Eugene concentrated his efforts, tapping into the Dragonic family's clandestine technique, the empty sword. Sword force converged, gradually layering upon itself. As Eugene achieved the overlapping of 3 layers, dark spots emerged within the undulating waves enveloping the holy sword. The holy sword trembled as if on the verge of splintering, a testament to the immense power amassed within its very being. What is that? Shock filled the Death Knight's eyes as he stared down. That technique did not belong to Hamel, so did it come from Vermouth or the Lionheart family? He couldn't clearly identify it, but he knew it was incredibly dangerous. The Death Knight wasn't certain if he would be capable of containing such massive power, but it was currently flowing in an incredibly sophisticated path throughout the sword. He couldn't spot any wastage of power either. It was a perfect technique. Haha. The Death Knight couldn't help but laugh when he saw the empty sword. The hatred he harbored for Vermouth's descendants, the anger he felt for having his technique stolen, as well as the resulting malice he felt for Eugene, all of it became rather faint. Joy filled him for the first time after becoming a Death Knight, causing him to laugh. A Hamel-like smile graced the Death Knight's face as he let out a chuckle, simultaneously bringing his sword down with force. A sinister black line materialized from the heavens, descending upon Eugene with the potential to cleave the world in two. The holy sword was raised shoulder-high and the superimposed layers had stabilized. All Eugene had to do was swing the sword and he had no reason not to. He didn't like how the Death Knight was giggling. He hated that the bastard dared to utter hatred for Anise, Sienna, Mullen, and Vermouth with his face, his body and his voice. Eugene felt malice towards the fact that the Death Knight laughed as if really believing that it was Hamel. Once more. Eugene's scowl intensified as he channeled his mana into the empty sword. Previously, black spots had burst forth, enveloping the flame and turning it entirely black with 3 overlapping layers. However, the current situation diverged. With the addition of another layer to the empty sword, the black spots spread rather than erupt. The transformation rendered the flame wholly black, surpassing mere coloration. The holy sword became shrouded in flames that possessed a menacing aura capable of captivating one's soul with a single glance. Moments before the Death Knight's sword connected with Eugene, he swiftly swung his own blade. In the past, his strike would have decapitated the enemy before it even reached them. But circumstances had changed. Since Eugene had achieved 4 layers of the empty sword, all the surrounding power began to decelerate. Even the Death Knight's sword, forged from dark power, succumbed to the influence exerted by Eugene's technique. Since the empty sword slowed down the sword of dark power, its swing wasn't too late. The force contained within it exploded and darkness quivered. The Death Knight's sword dispersed and disappeared upon making contact with the empty sword. It was Eugene's sword, not the Death Knight's sword, that ended up cleaving the world into 2. Death. It was the only thought that dominated his mind. The black flame did not dwindle despite having extinguished his dark power. The Death Knight immediately pushed himself backward while placing his left hand over his heart. He could not afford to hesitate. I'm going to die. What could he do in this situation? Could he beat his opponent even if he used ignition? Could he be allowed to die here? His artificial memories became infused with the reality of the current situation. The artificial personality he was given developed a will. He could not find a way to overcome the current crisis in his memories. Right now, the Death Knight did not have Anise, Sienna, Mullen, or Vermouth by his side. He had to get through this on his own. Although he had already died once, he could not afford to die again. He still had so much he had to achieve. He bent his fingers and dug into his heart. He felt his unbeating heart with the tip of his fingers. The door of dark power existed instead of cores, and although it was already open, it wasn't enough. The Death Knight twisted and tore open the gate with his own hands. Ignition. As the door expanded, an outpouring of dark power surged forth. In that precise instant, a burst of illumination pierced through the Death Knight's mind. His sense of self expanded in tandem with the enlarged door. The Death Knight's movements changed. He forced into existence another sword formed from dark power. Although his power had been great before, it could not compare to the power he exuded now after using ignition. The violent surge of dark power gave him a weapon, and at this moment he threw away his pride as Hamel. He only had one desire, and it was to survive. He could not die. The fortified sword of dark power intercepted the advance of the empty sword. The Death Knight's heart, though devoid of a pulse, trembled as if on the verge of shattering into fragments. The dark power, gushing forth from the shattered door, consumed the Death Knight's body in its scorching flames. Amidst the crimson and ebony inferno, the Death Knight locked eyes with Eugene, the 2 adversaries meeting in a riveting gaze. Eugene's lips twisted into a scowl. He whispered under his breath while staring at his old face, "Bastard." The wing of prominence blazed fiercely behind his back. Since their initial encounter, he had refrained from leaping through space. It was to ensure that he could kill the bastard by beating him in his perceived area of expertise. Ignition. A bastard like you? The simmering anger caused Eugene to place his hand on his heart, but he quickly regained his composure. He didn't need to use ignition. Against that bastard? What for? He had no intention of using ignition to kill the Death Knight. He synchronized himself with the fluttering feathers. Instead of causing his heart and cores to run rampant, he chose to replace ignition with prominence. He was being pushed back. For a slight moment, the enormous pool of dark power, which threatened to disintegrate the Death Knight's body, had prevented the advance of the empty sword, providing the Death Knight with a slight advantage. I won. The Death Knight thought momentarily, but it never turned into a conviction. Instead, his optimistic thought was immediately denied. Eugene's power was amplified by prominence, and it completely wasted the Death Knight's dark power. The curtain of darkness was lifted for a moment. Eugene's sword had lacerated the entire space occupied by the curtain. The Death Knight could think no thoughts at that moment. It was only aware of the harsh reality. Devoid of dark power and with his sword shattered, the Death Knight faced a grim reality. Eugene's blade had pierced through his body, rendering him not just wounded but utterly extinguished. The lower half of the Death Knight's form was no more, consumed by the devouring flames of the very same inferno that brought about his demise. The wound inflicted upon him was undeniably fatal. The Death Knight opened his mouth unknowingly. However, no words came. He could not say anything even though numerous thoughts swirled around in his mind. He was left with a series of questions. The Death Knight barely managed to speak. I lost? To you? Eugene stood in front of him. The Death Knight reached for Eugene while bleeding dark power. The gesture felt almost desperate, and Eugene reached out in the same way as if to respond. Unlike the Death Knight's helplessly floundering hand, a flame of mana burned inside Eugene's steady palm. Prominence's feather combined with the flame, creating a miniature sun. Black spots spread on the surface of the sun and turned it black. Eclipse swallowed the Death Knight's hand. At the same time, the holy sword pierced his heart. His heart was destroyed, and Eclipse started to devour what was left of him. The Death Knight couldn't help but laugh at the sight. I can't beat you. Such were his last words before Eclipse made an ash of his remaining flesh. Eugene muttered while glaring at the dispersing ashes. Of course you can't, you bastard. The Death Knight had been a ghost of the past and a fake one to boot. If Eugene struggled to vanquish such an opponent, then all the moments he had invested in this existence would have amounted to naught. Eugene lowered the holy sword with a snort.